Hello there and welcome to episode 79 of Right Where You're Sitting Now. Joining me this week, as ever, the what's the word I'm looking for? The mysterious Mark Satyr.
Sphinx-like and mysterious. Yes, I'm doing very well actually. Thank you very much. Actually, and I saw a friend of mine recently called Paul Christian, known to some, who's a druid and a minister of religion, and has also been the head of the Chiltern Nimmerton Grove for 22 years. So that's something to celebrate. So there we are.
So, what are we talking about this week, Mr. Satyr?
Well, this episode starts with a vision of a fantastical naked woman with red scarlet hair cascading down her back, riding upon a ferocious beast, a monstrous saber-toothed tiger, because we are talking about Jack Parsons, the legend and legacy of Jack Whiteside Parsons, rocket scientist, again visionary, I've said that already, and a fascinating and important character, and scientist who today we wouldn't have travel beyond the stars without him, because of the solid fuel work he did, he explored the different things of fuel.
It's interesting. It's not the first time we've covered Jack Parsons on the show. We had Peter Gray recently. Before that, actually a long time ago, we did a show on Parsons with Brian Butler, filmmaker who is associated with Kenneth Anger, who also links into to Parsons in a roundabout kind of way.
We've mentioned him a few times, and he's got a crater named after him on the dark side of the moon, simply called Parsons.
Yeah.
So there we are.
I think what I wanted to do with this episode was to get a more forensic look at the man, but also a more of a broad overview, because obviously we tend to focus on the occult side of these characters. So this time we have Mr. George Pendle, someone I've personally wanted to have this guy on the show for a long time, and we started arranging this interview a while ago, and finally we've made it happen.
I got very excited about the opportunity to speak to Mr. Pendle. It's become a bit of a cliche that I say I'm very privileged to do this, and I'm going to have to come up with some new cliches, because that's how I generally feel, and it was great. They say never meet your heroes, but I'll tell you what, I've been a very fortunate person doing this podcast, so there we are.
There you go. Excellent. Anyway, let's go and talk to Mr. George Pendle. Hello, George Pendle. It's so great to finally have you on the show. Could you give us a brief biography of yourself, please?
So I'm a writer and an author living in Washington, D.C. I grew up in England on the East Coast in Essex. And I worked for the Times of London for a while in London, but eventually I moved over to the United States in 2001, September 10th, 2001, and so that kind of made me feel as though I had to stay for a little longer than just a short stay. Ever since then, I've been writing for various newspapers and magazines, written a few more books, basically for whoever will have me, and I try to write about those kind of loose threads on the blanket of history, those ones that perhaps people haven't really paid attention to, and I try to bring out why those stories are important.
Excellent. So let's talk recently. You wrote a book quite a while ago now, an excellent book called Strange Angel: The Otherworldly Life of Rocket Scientist John Whiteside Parsons. And obviously, listeners of our show will probably know that there was a TV show of the same name that came out, I think, 3 or 4 years ago now.
That's right.
Could you talk a bit about your involvement in that series?
Yeah, it was a series based on my book. They optioned it, and they asked me to be a kind of consultant for the TV series. And they were very kind, very nice. But I think it was rather, it's a common thing in Hollywood for scriptwriters and directors to want to be as far away as possible from the author of a book. I think they're rather concerned that, I'd leap in with all sorts of suggestions that were impractical or ridiculous. But I was involved as a consultant, and the show ran for 2 series, which was not bad. It was quite fun. It was a somewhat of an imaginative reconstruction of my book, which I didn't mind. They had paid for it. They could do what they wanted with it. But it was, I think it really got bits of the Parsons story right. I think it got a few other things a bit wrong. But in the end, I was happy to see, how the sausage is made, so to speak. It was an interesting insight into Hollywood, and interesting in other ways because Parsons himself had always wanted to kind of get into the movie business at some, when he was a young man. So it was interesting to tell his story in the very business that he wanted to be in.
And how did you find the lead? I think it's an actor called Jack Rayner who played Parsons himself. Were you pleased with that casting?
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, he's an Irish actor. In fact, many cast were English or Irish. I had very little to do with the actual casting of it. In fact, I had nothing to do with it. But I thought he did a good job. He had that kind of, Errol Flynnish quality that I think Parsons had, able to carry a moustache well. He could, he was, a bit of a rake, but he could also do the studious element to Parsons, which kind of underlaid his kind of rakish personality. So I thought he did a pretty good job.
Yeah, and also he went on to be in the summer. What was it called? That film, Summer?
Oh, Midsummer.
Midsummer. Yes. Soon after. I don't know what he's doing at the moment, but I wonder if he's going to have a bit of a cultish niche. But I mean, I thought it was great. I mean, I really enjoyed the whole series, and I thought they took artistic license, but especially in the second season. But I was generally disappointed that we didn't see it through, because the third part would actually been the most interesting. And it is a fascinating story. It's an absolutely fascinating story. There's no need really to over-egg the cake. But I thought that they did but still. And also as well, it was filmed, wasn't it? Some of it was actually filmed at Caltech, in the actual locations and things. So yeah.
That's right. I mean, it was, for them, it was a very inexpensive film for them to do, because although it was period, it was all in the very area where they were shooting. But I agree. I felt that Parsons' story doesn't really need much exaggeration. It's and I as well as you, I was very sad that it ended when it did, which is on the arrival of L. Ron Hubbard. And
I know, how annoying is that?
For a while, there were a few. I mean, should we be suspicious that a film studio in a city in which, a quasi-religion runs a lot of the film studios or has a lot of famous actors in their employ should suddenly shut down a TV show featuring L. Ron Hubbard? There are a few little mysterious, or other thoughts that this may have been some kind of backhanded, underhanded rather, skullduggery going on to kind of scupper the TV show, but I can't confirm or deny that.
Yeah, it's intriguing. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. Let's sort of set the scene for those who aren't well versed in Jack Parsons. Let's sort of set the scene for the the kind of the social climate he was growing up in, and what was his kind of childhood like.
So Jack Parsons, he grew up in Pasadena, which is this wealthy kind of suburb really of Los Angeles, where it was at the time. And he was, he had a wealthy upbringing. He was a single child. He was brought up by his mother. His father had kind of left the family when he was young. And he was brought up with his mother and his grandfather in Pasadena. and I think he was a rather spoiled child. He was definitely a kind of rather podgy, bullied child, and his one great solace, even though he was quite well off, he was bullied a lot at school. His one great solace was science fiction magazines, particularly things like Amazing Stories. He was a great fan of these, and I think he kind of, like many people, like many of us who were bullied when we were young, we kind of sink into great fantastical worlds, and he was aided in that by the great kind of golden age writers of the time. Now the thing was, this was his kind of childhood, but it ended pretty abruptly, the kind of privilege, when the Depression came and his family lost a lot of money, and his grandfather died, and he and his mother were kind of left as a single parent family in Pasadena without much wealth. And it was then that he kind of started to kind of look around and see what he could do with his life. And I think because of the sci-fi comics, because he was so, convinced that the sci-fi comics weren't just a fantasy, but they were predictive, that they would tell the future, as many of them did. That he didn't have to look far before he saw Caltech, and there at Caltech, at the California Institute of Technology, there were many scientists working on telescopes, astronomy, creating crazy things like helicopters, which were absolutely beyond the pale at the time. This is in the 30s, and with his kind of belief that the rockets he had read about in science fiction magazines could somehow be brought into reality, he went to Caltech and started to ask around and see whether there was anybody who would help him make rockets.
And it's also important for us to remember now that at the time, the sober, orthodox scientific opinion was that space travel, space rockets, and which featured in space fiction were impossible. That it couldn't happen. You couldn't travel through space. It was just something because you can get a grip on it or whatever. But it was and so there was a whole. It was far more fiction than it is now. It's interesting how these things some of these ideas have crept into reality.
That's absolutely right. I mean, at the time, Parsons was reading these comics in the 30s, and when he went to Caltech to see if he could build rockets with anyone there, no universities had any courses on rocketry. It was still kind of used as a kind of sign of madness. You say, oh, he's the sort of guy who thinks you can send a rocket to the moon. It was seen as ridiculous, which in hindsight seems crazy that 30 years before the moon landing, people were like laughing at the idea of going into space as ridiculous. It's a strange kind of period. He really straddles a kind of Victorian age and a modern age, and many of the people in the universities were still very much plodding along. I mean, they were doing science, they were doing groundbreaking science, don't get me wrong, but when it came to like making imaginative leaps, certainly in the area of like advanced aerodynamics, like with rockets, there was nobody there. And really all the kind of a lot of the science fiction stories of the time were written by scientists kind of hypothesizing, like, could a rocket work? There were scientists who wrote under pseudonyms in the science fiction magazines, because if they were really found out as writing these stories, they'd be thrown out of their teaching posts. It was a very interesting time, and Parsons, it just kind of gives you an idea of the kind of imaginative power he could pull upon, that this didn't worry him at all. He thought, why not? Why couldn't we build a rocket?
Yeah, I mean, it's intriguing that we're on the brink of talking about making active plans to colonize Mars, and people use it for this term of like terraforming Mars and so on. I mean, that the phrase terraforming, I mean, that comes from science fiction. It comes from Jack Williamson himself. He was a science fiction writer that Jack Parsons knew. So it's interesting how, if you told them at the time, that people were generally sort of speculating, well, how can we do that now in generations to come on Mars or what have you, then that would have been quite extraordinary.
Yeah,
that's
extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. Yeah. It's extraordinary that we're sat now having that conversation about it.
Yeah, I mean, you think like, less than 100 years ago, there was a guy who was studying rockets, name of Goddard, Robert Goddard, and he was kind of working by himself. He was, he had been working in Massachusetts, up in the northeast of America, and he had let loose a rocket test back in the 1910s, I believe, maybe 1920s. Sorry, he had set a rocket test which had gone wrong and had crashed into a house and set a house on fire. And he had been a university professor at the time, and he had been lambasted, he had been lampooned, he had been mocked, and he had eventually been chased out of New England down to the desert where he could do his tests by himself. But he had been so scarred by the public opinion and the media kind of just saying he's obviously a lunatic. I mean, literally lunatic, a guy, who is obsessed with the moon. That he could never really work with anybody else again because he had been so. And this was in the 1920s, less than 100 years ago. People were driving people to despair for even thinking about making rockets.
Yeah, it's interesting. So let's talk, because around the time of Parsons growing up, science fiction was really kind of blossoming, wasn't it? It was a real, it become very, very popular and a lot more, I guess, mainstream at the time. But why do you think it had such an influence on Parsons? And, maybe let's talk a little bit about some of the kind of the writers he was reading and, some of the fiction he was looking at.
Yeah, I mean, as was mentioned, Jack Williamson was this, a great science fiction writer of the time. And there were, Heinlein was getting going, and, Ray Bradbury was just starting off as a writer at the time. And you have all these kind of great voices in this, in what is basically a subculture run by teenage boys and prepubescent boys. They're the main fans of these books. And I think there was something about it which is just that perennial, escape of fantasy. There was this kind of prophetic nature to it that for a lot of teenage boys, I think at the time, they really believed in. And I think, if you trace the people who worked on the space race back in the 60s, or even, somebody like Wernher von Braun, they were all reading science fiction because this was the only place where those ideas were being discussed. And I think for Parsons, he's a bullied boy. They offer a kind of escape from his life at the time, but they also offer a practical guide as to how to build rockets. He was, even with his grandfather, he'd been making little cardboard rockets in the back garden. He had been, filling cardboard rolls with gunpowder and just setting them off like basic fireworks. But somewhere within the literature, even though it was aimed at a quote, juvenile audience, there were enough details and there was enough respect for the ideas by these writers. They thought, I'm not just going to say there's a rocket attached to a ship. I'm going to tell you how the gunpowder in the rocket is shaped. Is it a honeycomb shape, or is it a staggered shape? Does it fire off like a machine gun, one blast at a time? Or is it, all in one thrust? I mean, just these kind of great ideas for, I guess it would be a bit like thinking about, I don't know, what would the equivalent be today? I mean, we've already gone so far in the technological distance that nothing quite seems impossible now, but maybe thinking about cold fusion or something like that.
Yeah.
It's the idea that, I'm sorry?
Yeah, I was like quantum computing. That's, something really, I was going to say time travel, but I thought that was maybe pushing it a bit too far.
But I don't think it's as crazy. I really think that response to time travel is similar to how people would have responded to rocketry. I mean, it really wasn't anywhere on people's radar. I mean, radar wasn't on people's radar at the time, but I really think rocketry was seen as ridiculous as time travel. And that's why it's hard to imagine something now, because almost everything seems vaguely possible. Freezing people and waking them up. Some people are trying that. Teleportation might be tricky, time travel might be tricky, but that's it. It's like one step beyond what seems possible. And so I think for a lot of people at the time, it offered, things were a lot more rigid. I think, a lot of scientists didn't want to try and shake things up because that just wasn't how science was working at the time.
Yeah, like sort of Blake says, what's what is real now was once but imagined, and that's a prophetic saying, especially in this sort of field, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's rather good of you to bring in Blake, because I think there is a kind of visionary sense of it at that time. I mean, even though, there were these rocket societies set up around the world by teenage boys reading science fiction magazines. And, they had a kind of, there was obviously the scientific, the technical proponent of it, but there was also this dream, this vision of, yeah, we may only be able to fire a rocket 20 feet in the air and it explodes, but one day that rocket will get us to, other planets, to other worlds, to other life forms, perhaps. I think there really was something. It's strange to think about it now in terms of science, where it doesn't really seem as well, mystical is the wrong word, but there isn't that kind of almost religious belief in it.
So how did Parsons kind of get involved in rocket science in the sense of like jet propulsion laboratories, that side of things? Where's the kind of connection point that I'm assuming, I'm feigning ignorance here for the listener's sake, but there's obviously a connection that happens between people at Caltech and Jack Parsons. So I was wondering, how could we discuss how that kind of happened? Yeah,
sure. Well, Parsons and his best friend at the time, a guy called Ed Foreman, had been making rockets kind of in their back gardens and in the Arroyo Seco, which is this kind of river valley nearby. And they had done all they could do, and they thought they needed some help. And so they went to Caltech, and they literally just walked in, and they, went to go and see somebody. They said, "Who's working on rockets here?" And of course, nobody was working on rockets. But there was one guy who had been, working a little bit on helicopters, and who was seen as kind of like the kind of out there guy working at Caltech. And his name was Frank Molina. And Frank Molina he was a maths whiz, and he was a very intelligent guy. And he got together with Parsons. He also read, Jules Verne. He was a great fan of sci-fi. And he got together with Parsons, and he read Parsons' notes. Parsons had been taking notes about all his rocket experiments. And he thought, maybe there is something here, and he took the two of them, even though Ed Foreman and Jack Parsons weren't members of Caltech. He took them to see his supervisor, who was the great scholar Theodore von Karman. Now, von Karman was an expert in, aeronautics, but he also had this kind of mischievous, far-reaching thought, and he thought he was possibly the one guy in the Western Hemisphere who would have thought, sure, why not? Have a go, build a rocket, see what you can do. And so he gave them kind of free rein to build rocket engines on Caltech. And slowly but surely, as they experiments in the courtyards, and they were filling up little metal containers and filling them full of gunpowder, and they were exploding, and these explosions reverberated around the campus. Slowly it attracted other kind of oddballs who were also interested in science fiction, or who were also interested in the possibilities of rockets. And so slowly but surely there was a small group, like 5 or 6 of them, no more. And they became known as the Suicide Squad, because every time they did an experiment, it seemed like they were going to kill themselves. And they were kind of, I think a lot of, the mainstream of Caltech kind of mocked them, but they just carried on doing their experiments. And bit by bit, they began to create basically a science out of nothing. I mean, there was really nothing to work on. And they started putting together their experiments results, seeing what the pressure was involved, what was needed, what fuels were best. And they created, what became eventually the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, just from a couple of outsiders and one enthusiast in Caltech, and a very, kind of wide-thinking von Karman. They created the Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
Yeah, I think they were they had to, after their sort of misadventures inside the actual main building, they were sort of moved to their experiments outside in a kind of shed, weren't they? Because because of the danger. They caused lots of havoc inside, and the danger, true. and they're still being sort of exploded out of doors and things like that. And there must have been a constant, now and again, explosions going off in the background. People thinking, don't worry, it's just them, not it's just the rocket science.
Totally, I think that's it. And they did that for long enough. I think one time they let out these fumes from their rocket indoors, and it kind of coated everything in rust, because it was such a virulent fuel they were using. But eventually they pushed the Caltech authorities so far that they got sent to the Arroyo Seco, to this kind of dry river valley, to do their experiments. And, they set up a little corrugated iron sandbag kind of shed out there and continued their experiments off the campus. And, they kept going and kept going. And ironically, that's where the JPL is now. The Jet Propulsion Laboratory is on the very site of their first experiments in the Arroyo Seco.
It's amazing, isn't it? So the JPL were somewhat involved with, quite intimately involved with the American efforts in World War II as well, weren't they? I was wondering if you could discuss that a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting. It was, again, another kind of crux point in Parsons' life, because, they wanted, Molina and Parsons and Foreman, they wanted to make rockets that, the prime aim of the rockets was to take man off the Earth into space. That was their dream. But of course, it was hard to kind of justify funding for that, because it still seemed such a ridiculous idea. But along comes World War II, and suddenly, the army is coming around, the military is coming around, saying, what have you guys got? What can help us in the battle? And, Molina and Parsons, they had these rockets, firing pretty powerfully at this time. And they thought they could tie these rockets or attach these rockets to planes' wings. And this would allow planes, heavily laden bombers to take off from short runways, or planes to take off from aircraft carriers, with a much shorter distance. They provided this kind of powerful punch. And this kind of really interested the Air Force in particular. And so, the Suicide Squad, which by now was the kind of nascent JPL, their first kind of job was making these JATOs, they were called, these JATO rockets, the Jet Assisted Takeoff Rocket, which would be attached to planes to take off from jungle runways, whatever. But even now, even though they were making rockets, the military and JPL couldn't even call them rockets. They still had to be jet-assisted, takeoff methods. Jet was a word you could use, even though they weren't jets. They were rockets. But rockets, if you even attach that to a military operation, people would go, "What the hell are you talking about?"
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's funny how much things have changed in such a short period of time, isn't it? It's only when you really start to look back at the story that you realise actually, you're right. It really has changed quite a lot, quite significantly.
Oh yeah,
yeah. So obviously, one of the other major components in Parsons's life was his discovery of a magical order called the OTO. And I was wondering, could you talk about how that all came about? How did Parsons sort of stumble upon the OTO?
Yeah, it's very interesting, because on the one side you have Pasadena, wealthy Pasadena, and Caltech, and science, and then you have Los Angeles, and you have Los Angeles at this time was going through, as it always seems to be going through, a kind of great spiritual awakening, in which there were Buddhist cults, there were Theosophists, there were all sorts of the I Am group, there were mesmerists. There was this kind of great awakening in the 20s and 30s for something apart from standard religion. And so Parsons, I think, was always drawn to that kind of that sort of thing. He had, as well as reading science fiction comics, he was very interested in myth, in The Golden Bough, by Fraser, in other books about magic, about real tales of magic. And I think he kind of treated them in the same way as he treated the science fiction books. These weren't just stories; these were guidelines. These were, especially The Golden Bough, which is this great anthropological look at magic through history. I think he saw it as well. It seems to be done in a very fairly scientific way. We've moved on from certain sorts of magic to other sorts of magic. And so I think he always had this part of his character. And when he was in Pasadena, he had some friends. He hung out with a pretty interesting kind of artistic group who said, "Why don't you come down? There's this new group in Los Angeles. Come down and see them." And he was invited to the OTO one night. And it was one of the services which they gave, which was the Thelemic Mass, they called it. And it was held in the attic of this grand Los Angeles house, and there was a congregation of which Parsons was part of. And on stage, there was a checkerboard kind of floor, an altar, and a coffin. And Parsons was brought into this, and he saw coming out of the coffin through the scores this woman, scantily clad lady. There was a priest there, kind of in almost a pharaoh-like get-up, chanting these words of, which referred to myth, which referred to something beyond myth, this kind of mystical world. And to Parsons, this was just like the greatest thing he'd ever seen. This seemed to be an entryway, a kind of door into the world of magic. And of course, what he was seeing there was the creation of Aleister Crowley. It was his OTO, Ordo Templi Orientis. It was his Thelemic Mass.
Yeah,
and
I was going to say, I mean, I think a friend of Parsons had a copy of Nox on Pax, although that wasn't a new book at the time. I mean, that was published originally in early 1900s. But he found that on the bookshelf of a friend, and there was something in that drew him in. There was something in that resonated with him, and and as you say, it's the I think they call it the Gnostic Catholic Mass that he attended, and then he attended meetings for about a year before making any significant commitment before actually joining. So there was that kind of testing waters thing. But yes, he's a hungry soul, and I mean, I always think of, and I'm not the only one, like science fiction is the sort of the modern vocabulary of the mythic. It's it's from a Jungian point of view. The ancients sat round. I seem to say this in every single episode, but I make no apology for it, because it is a key point. The ancients sat round the feast fire, and they talked about the gods and the monsters, and the shaman or the storyteller, that saw them. They saw them in the flames, and then now we all sit around the television and eating pizzas and watching, I don't know, the latest Marvel film or something like that. It's we in our caves, so it still speaks to the hungry soul, doesn't it?
I think so, very much, and I think that's really beautifully put. It's and both of them, both the science fiction and what Parsons was soon to find in the OTO, is this this idea of transcendence, which they both offer. There's the transcendence of the human from Earth, breaking free of the chains of Earth and discovering a whole new universe. There's the same thing in the OTO, in Crowley's teachings, which was the idea of freeing oneself from one's current state, from one's humanity, and becoming a kind of superhuman in a way. And I think that there were those parallels that were running in Parsons' mind at the same time.
And there's also a coherent philosophy there, and if you at the time an inclination, irrespective of if you accept it or not, it's there. There's a coherent philosophy.
Oh,
and I think
very much
so.
that
would appeal to him. I know that he took a brief interest in. I mean, he probably, like lots of people, sampled lots of different things, but there was something about Thelema, something about the OTO, something about Crowley, which spoke to him in a way which these other things didn't. I know. He had, I think he went to theosophy. There was a bit of a dabbling with theosophy, and I think he went to see a lecture by Krishna Hart. What was Krishna? I can't say his name. Krishna Harti, the sort of the wannabe, the intended messiah of the theosophist movement, and but he did that didn't. It was a bit too milk and water probably for him, and it wasn't his cup of tea.
Yeah, it's interesting why he chose the OTO over everything else that was going on in LA. And I think there is a kind of, correct me if I'm going off the mark here, but there's a certain technical kind of step-by-step kind of feeling to the OTO, which Crowley put in, the kind of level by level, you learn these levels, which I think might have appealed to his kind of scientific background, that you kind of work your way, slowly. It doesn't all come at once. You've got to work your way through the levels before you reach, the heart. But it's just, I think there was also something about Crowley, and I'm sure he got this, Crowley's reputation, obviously, I think probably infused the OTO for Parsons, at least, with definitely with some intrigue. I think he liked the idea that Crowley might be a little evil. As well as being this great creator, I think there was something titillating almost about Crowley's reputation at the time.
So what's kind of interesting with Parsons as well is he showed some early signs of occult interest when he was a kid as well, didn't he? There's a story of him and summoning the devil at one point, or in his childhood.
That's right. He says kind of rather mysteriously in a later kind of, when he was older, he wrote about this moment in his childhood when he tried to summon the devil in his bedroom at the age of 12, and how he succeeded and he never tried again. That was it. And I'm not too sure how much this is kind of a sudden myth making from Parsons later on in his life, but I think we've all done something like that at that age of 12. You've maybe said Candyman in the mirror or whatever you've done, scare yourself, to try and see if maybe it's just right. You scare yourself to the point of belief. But yeah, definitely from a young age, he was always interested in that kind of where reality ends and something else starts, or rather where something else breaks into reality.
Yeah, I mean, curiously, you mentioned Crowley there. I mean, Crowley's mentor in an early part of his age was Alan Bennett, and when Alan Bennett was a young man, was a child, he also decided one day that I'm going to summon the devil, and had some sort of experience which scared him for the rest of his that time until when he became an adult. So it seems
that's
to be a bit
fascinating.
He's not the first or last person who's had a similar sort of experience.
What kind of sort of effect do you think the OTO kind of had on Parsons's life, in general over the years?
So I think the OTO had a very positive effect on his life, certainly to begin with. I mean, it's not often you can say that, you are fulfilled both professionally and personally. And I think, Parsons was building rockets by day and, studying the tenets of Crowley's religion of Thelema by night. And I think he really saw the two as kind of going hand in hand, just kind of, he was becoming, a new kind of man, a kind of space, man, and also, a kind of new religious kind of man. He was a spiritual man. And I think it was very positive. Of course, every now and then the two worlds would kind of cross over, and so you would have this kind of sorry, somebody was just coming in the door. Of course, every now and then the two worlds would cross over, and he would, for instance, start chanting kind of Crowley's poem, the hymn to Pan, while his rockets were being tested. And, occasionally he'd bring scientists from his scientific world to the OTO. And this, of course, led to certain frictions between the two, because although he felt totally at ease between the two worlds, many of the people, both in the OTO and within his scientific world, within the JPL, didn't feel that ease between the two worlds.
Yeah, I found that within the TV show, actually, that was demonstrated quite well. I mean, that was they did take some quite severe artistic license at times, but I did really enjoy the way that they showed those kind of tensions between the two in the show. I thought that was well done, at least.
Yeah,
yeah,
and also the sort of the jet, the rockets, the space rockets, and magic were two things derided. Received wisdom. They were derided by the world, but he had the kind of the strength of vision to sort of go beyond that or strive.
Yeah, and I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think, there was something about his success at rockets which made him push ever harder into his magic life. Because if he had succeeded in rockets, which everybody had laughed about 10 years before, why couldn't he succeed in magic, which everybody was laughing about now? It was a really interesting way he just carried them both within his mind.
Mm. So we spoke briefly earlier about one particular member of the OTO, Wilfred Smith. I was wondering, can you talk about Parsons and his kind of evolving relationship, I'd say, with Smith? Because it wasn't all puppy dogs and, and flowers, that relationship. And then Crowley kind of got involved with that relationship at one point as well, which was quite interesting.
Yeah, it was very interesting. And, despite it being this great spiritual organization, there was this undercurrent to it of, when is it going to make any money? When is, Crowley in particular at this time was, in the late 1930s, we're talking about now, the early days of the Blitz, was kind of destitute. And he was really relying on donations from his OTO branches to survive. And so when Parsons came along, Wilfred Smith, the head of the OTO in Los Angeles, wrote to Crowley and said, we have this great new guy. He's a rocket scientist. He's totally open to all our teaching. I'm going to take him under our wing and see what we can do with him, see if we can turn him into a great, disciple of yours. And he did to begin with. I think he taught, Parsons everything that he had to know. And Parsons indeed started to correspond with Crowley. And I think he saw this as a kind of a real, moving forward in his spiritual kind of growth. But Crowley, at this time was cantankerous, addicted to heroin, and incredibly poor. And so he was very unhappy with what Wilfred Smith was doing. And so even though Parsons was kind of beholden to Wilfred Smith, Crowley started to see this kind of discontent in, he didn't need to see any discontent in himself, but in Parsons saying, maybe Wilfred Smith isn't everything, maybe you should take over. And there was this kind of struggle between Smith and Crowley and Parsons, a kind of three-way struggle for who would control the OTO in Los Angeles. And eventually, Smith had just been displeasing Crowley again and again and again. And Crowley, in this kind of wonderful way of disposing of somebody who was displeasing him, just declared one day that Smith was a god and therefore should go out into the desert and commune with the universe on high. And it seems to me, certainly that this was just Crowley kind of, elbowing somebody he didn't like out the way. But for Smith, it kind of put him in a strange situation. He was a devout follower of Crowley. Was Crowley really saying he was a god, or was he mocking him? And anyway, what happened was that the Smith eventually was thrown out, and Parsons took his place and became, the head of the OTO in Los Angeles and Crowley's man in America, really, on the West Coast.
It's interesting. We spoke to Tobias Churton not so long ago, who's written several books on Crowley. And he basically implied that during this period, Crowley was laser focused on trying to actually move to America, and he saw that as his kind of retribution almost. Like, I guess because I think at that point the OTO in America, at least, were they the only version of the OTO at the time?
Yeah, well, yeah. the only really flourishing version of it, certainly.
Yeah, so I assume he felt, oh well, I can eke out a good living there at least, and I have a good flock of followers and etc. So I thought that was a kind of a interesting point. So he obviously probably saw Jack Parsons as perhaps a vehicle for that. I don't know.
Also, the W.T. Smith and this sort of magical retirement he prescribes for him, it's something that Crowley in his life always did to himself. I mean, you mentioned the Golden Bough. I mean, he took a magical retirement, and the Golden Bough was one of the books he took away to sort of study. And, so he went through these periods where he withdrew from the world and, and had an intense inner focus, lived essentially a kind of monastic life you'd recognize as a sort of essentially monastic in a kind of magical sense. So what you're prescribing from W.T. Smith wasn't something he was part of the curriculum, basically. I think you're right. I think he was playing two games at once. I think he was playing to go. I think maybe half of Crowley was thinking, well, I think Smith is an unknown god because we all are. And and there might be and if he goes off to the desert and discovers that and comes back, and sweeps the OTO to pinnacles of power, then all to the good. I think he was playing two sort of games. So
yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. I think there's always that contradiction in Crowley, isn't it? That he's the kind of he is the beast, because you can't quite get to grips with him at any one point. And I think, as you were saying before, Ken, that he did want to go to the States. He thought that the States, like so many people, he thought that would be his kind of, that's his lottery ticket in a way. That's how he's going to become world famous. And really, there were so many other religions that were taking off at the time. I think he was a bit disappointed to find that, he wasn't better well known in the States at the time.
I think the journey would probably have killed him as well, because he was very physically,
quite probably.
He was physically very feeble. He wouldn't have survived.
Yeah.
He wouldn't have survived. I really don't think he would have done. So, I mean, his ashes ended up in America. So
he got there eventually.
Got there eventually.
So, why did Jack create the parsonage? Could you tell us a bit about what the parsonage is and why Jack decided to create it?
Yeah. So. Parsons, when he became the head of the OTO, he was also doing very well with the rockets. He had made a lot of money from basically turning his rocket research into a company, which was called Aerojet at the time. And so he thought he would kind of become the kind of paterfamilias of the OTO at the time. And so he bought a big house in Pasadena, one of the great old mansions, that had been lived in by moneyed families for half a century. And he installed himself there and the OTO there, and also anybody else who he thought was interesting or amusing. It was very, very much like a kind of 60s commune, but before the letter. And it was this great old house, 1003 South Orange Grove, and it was just full of, as you can imagine, like prime American kind of Gothic, kind of swirling staircases and hidden doorways and things like this. And the OTO lived there, and he paid for them. He was basically looking after everybody there. And there were also other people that he found interesting, like science fiction writers or like other scientists who needed a place to stay. And the parsonage became both the headquarters for the OTO, but also the kind of headquarters for the cult of Jack, the headquarters of the cult of Parsons. They'd have ceremonies there, the OTO ceremonies, but they'd also have these parties in which the worlds kind of forcibly met. Parsons really threw his two worlds together at the parsonage. And that's where, you'd have scientists dressing in black robes or mages talking to engineers. It was this kind of great mixing pot of the era. But of course, the only problem about this is that, you have all these raging parties, your neighbors start to resent you. And that started to happen to Jack. His reputation as being, somebody, who was kind of verging on, suspicious, somebody who was really quite out there, just started growing and growing. And, with the Air Force being interested in his rockets and, with just the local police being interested in what was going on, he started to get a bad reputation throughout the neighborhood.
Yeah, and obviously one of the people that turned up there sort of became somewhat of a nemesis of his later, but it started off as a firm friend and collaborator. Let's talk about how the future head of the Church of Scientology moved into the parsonage.
Right. So Parsons had put an advert in the local newspaper, which was basically saying, if you're an atheist or a free thinker or anything like this, come to the house. And we're not quite sure whether Hubbard saw that or whether it was through, by now Parsons knew quite a few of the local sci-fi writers, whether it came through them. But Hubbard had just been discharged from the Navy. I'm not sure whether it was honorably or dishonorably, but suddenly he wasn't being asked back. And he was now in Pasadena looking for a place to live. And he came upon Jack's house. And Jack, knowing of his writing from Astounding Science Fiction magazine, kind of welcomed him in. And really, there was something in Hubbard that just clicked with Jack. And it's hard now to think of Hubbard as somebody who isn't like this ominous head of this mysterious religion. But by all intents and purposes, he was at that time incredibly charismatic. He could somehow carry a room, with the sheer strength of his personality. And I think Parsons loved his tall stories. He loved the fact that he could kind of, Hubbard was renowned for typing something like, 1,000 words an hour or something like that, just unedited science fiction text, just reeling it off. And I think Parsons loved that ability to create stories and to create narratives just at the drop of a hat. And so he welcomed Hubbard into his life and welcomed him into the ODO. And Hubbard, if we're going to take him as a cynical human being, which perhaps we should, saw something in the OTO that would allow him to live a life of, absolute luxury at somebody else's, dime, on somebody else's dime. So Hubbard started off as this, this friend, but soon, as you mentioned, things started changing.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So let's talk about, because obviously Hubbard appears in his life, but then also someone equally as important appears in his life around this sort of time as well. Let's talk a bit about the Babylon working, because this became a huge event in Parsons' life, like a groundbreaking, a earth-shattering in many ways event in Parsons' life.
Yeah, so Parsons, as the head of the OTO, had started to kind of veer away a bit from Crowley's teachings. It wasn't that he didn't respect Crowley, it's just that he really was looking for something visible, something tangible, which I think maybe he wasn't finding entirely within the OTO's system. And so he started kind of creating his own magical rituals to a certain extent. And one of these was the Babylon working. Now, he wrote to Crowley at the time, I believe, saying that he was going to do a working with his friend Ron, who he thought was, very magically capable, and the two of them were going to try and kind of summon a moon child, I believe he referred to it as, into the world. Now Crowley thought, didn't know what he was talking about. Of course, he had written a book called Moonchild, but Parsons was kind of sticking together these different magical kind of rituals all together into his own kind of religion. And so he and L. Ron Hubbard, for I believe it was about 2 months every day, began this, or were taking part in this ritual in which they'd, draw sigils in the sky with a sword, they'd light candles, they'd, fertilize magical tablets, basically by masturbating onto paper tablets. There was a certain amount of Enochian magic being used here that Parsons had picked up. And Hubbard, who I don't know how much he knew, but he was very good at playing along with people, decided to play along with Parsons. And so for, I think, 2 months, every day, there'd be these magical rituals going on with the idea that somehow they would summon the goddess Babylon into the world. And Babylon being she who rides the beast on the beast's back in the book of Revelation. And so this went on. And, the other people in the house, even the other members of the OTO, were like, what is going on? Like, everything is so tense in the house. There's this constant spiritual presence. And every now and then something would burst out of the room where they were doing their magical working. For instance, Hubbard one day said that there was a giant, cloud in the kitchen. And so Parsons had to grab a sword and attack it. Somebody saw a banshee screaming at the window. There was this kind of very strange, for those who don't believe, it would be like a mass hysteria. But for those who did, it was like Parsons was really probing and pushing at the edges of reality and trying to conjure something into the world. And at the end of this Babylon working, he said he had succeeded and that Babylon now walked the earth. Of course, nobody was quite sure what he meant by that, but we were soon to see that suddenly a very strident female figure was about to enter his life.
Yeah, and that was Marjorie Cameron. And Cameron obviously becomes somewhat of a scarlet lady for him, in fact. But she also, she sort of survives Parsons, and we see her appearing in the films of Kenneth Anger, for example. And so she's a really interesting character. So if we could talk briefly about Marjorie Cameron, I think that would be good.
Yeah, Marjorie Cameron, or Cameron as she was later known by, kind of appeared in Parsons' life. I think she had friends who had stayed at the parsonage, or she knew of it, and it sounded like an interesting place. And she arrived in Parsons' life, and Parsons saw her, this woman with kind of red hair and green eyes, pale skin. And he just thought, this is my Scarlet Lady. This is somebody who has arrived to help me further my magic, And he wrote to Crowley again, saying, I found her. I found the Scarlet Lady in my life, and the two of them, from that point on, kind of performed all the sex magic rituals of the OTO that Parsons was still learning or kind of adapting to his own cause. And Cameron became this foil to Parsons in a way. Parsons was pushing forward in his magical life, and Cameron kind of helped him, but also kind of undercut him. And she was this kind of ferocious and totally independent woman who would help Jack to a certain extent, but when she had had enough, would leave. And whenever she left, Jack was often thrown into a depression because she wasn't there anymore.
And in the end, after Parsons' death, she plays the role of Babylon in Kenneth Anger's inauguration of the Pleasure Dome. And for so many people, for many generations, she is like almost the iconic, one of the great iconic images of Babylon. So there we are, you see, there's the magic at work for you.
That's right. I mean, she became kind of what Parsons had wanted her to be, which is this kind of link to him and Crowley and the mystical just through herself. She was, not only the Kenneth Anger films, but her paintings and drawings are these incredibly powerful piece of artwork, which are being, there were recent shows in Los Angeles about them. She's really being kind of rediscovered as this kind of this link not only between ages, between the past and the modern, but also between that mystical era that Parsons lived in.
So obviously there was somewhat of a conflict between Hubbard and Parsons. I'd like to talk about that, but also this is sort of the beginning of Parsons' decline, really, as well. And it's an interesting flip of the coin in a way, isn't it? I was wondering if we could just look into that a little bit. Parsons and the boat in particular is an interesting, interesting story.
It is very interesting. It seems like Hubbard stayed with Parsons for some months. He had helped out with the Babylon working. But what was happening in the house at the time was this kind of mishmash of kind of OTO principles and what Parsons thought was kind of cool. And so there was a lot of, swapping of partners. It had a certain kind of, as I said, a kind of commune kind of vibe. And what happened was, to begin with, was that Hubbard took away Parsons' girlfriend, or didn't take her away. Parsons' girlfriend went towards Hubbard, and they became a couple. And I think this really affected Parsons, because although he was a proponent of, kind of free love and nobody feeling jealous, he found that this really somehow got to him. And, Hubbard smoothed it over and said, look, let's go into a business together. We don't need to fight about, who we're partners with. And they sort of had this business in which they invested basically all of Parsons' savings into buying boats, into buying a number of yachts in Florida that Hubbard said he would sail around from Florida to Los Angeles, and they would sell there at a mass profit. Now, I think Hubbard said, he'd been in the Navy, he knew how to handle boats, this was going to be great. But he had no intention of doing that. He just wanted a boat that he could sail down to the Caribbean with Parsons' ex-girlfriend Betty, and basically leave Parsons high and dry. Now, while they were buying the boats, Parsons found out about this. He was starting to have doubts about Hubbard by this point, and he rushed to Florida to where they had the boats, only to find out that he was too late, that the boats had set sail with Hubbard and Betty in them, sailing for the Caribbean. And at this point, Parsons went to his hotel room, and he settled himself down, and he began a magical working in order to get Hubbard back and Betty back. And so he began this magical working, and at that point, as he tells it, a giant storm came off the coast, blew the yachts back into the harbor, and Parsons was able to go and confront Hubbard and Betty. He managed to get some of his money back. He didn't get his girlfriend back, and he didn't get a large amount of his money back from Hubbard. But that was the end of the relationship. And from that moment on, it feels like Hubbard had kind of cut himself adrift from Crowley's teachings to a certain extent, and had, decided he didn't want to fund everybody in the OTO or live with them anymore. He was kind of cut adrift himself. He was lost between what he had been and what he was going to be. The scientific world had kind of thrown him out because he was just too eccentric. They couldn't have scientists, chanting the Ode to Pan every time a rocket went off. It just wasn't done. And so he was thrown out of his scientific world and out of his mystical, his religious world too. And he was left by himself. He sold the parsonage and moved to somewhere outside Pasadena with Marjorie Cameron, and that was it. He was just left by himself.
What's interesting is we had another author on we've had him on a few times, but several months ago, who wrote a book called The Two Antichrists, an author called Peter Gray. And one of the points he made that I felt was really interesting was that of all of Crowley's kind of disciples and all of his kind of, because obviously Hubbard was never actually a member of the ATO, but he was obviously influenced by Crowley quite heavily, especially if you read Dianetics. I mean, it's clearly there, a lot of Crowley's stuff. But one of the sort of sad sides of it really is that you could say Hubbard was potentially the most successful of his, Scientology's huge, regardless of what you think of it. It's the man did create a religion, and it's a huge multi-million, perhaps billion-dollar enterprise now, isn't it? So it's kind of a bit depressing in a way.
As I say in the book, I remember this, that Hubbard was everything that Crowley wanted to be. He wanted the OTO to be similarly a massive franchised concern. I think he wanted his name to be spread around the world in, different chapters everywhere. But he didn't get that. I mean, what he did do is kind of spur on, I think, Hubbard to actually succeed in that. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned Dianetics, which first appeared in Astounding Science Fiction. That's where it first appeared in a science fiction magazine. And so you really have Hubbard kind of taking all he can from Parsons, from the science fiction world, from Crowley, and kind of creating this hybrid, which neither Parsons nor Crowley really managed to do, but for whatever reason, he got the magic juice. He somehow, got what people wanted, which was the kind of dash of self-help, some scientific mysticism, all in a palatable, not too abstruse form.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So obviously the end of Parsons' life. Let's talk about that, and also the controversy, shall we say, about there are many theories of what actually happened on the day of his death, but and what may have led up to it. I'm really interested in your take on that, and but that's so we've placed him with Marjorie Cameron. Let's talk about the kind of the final hours of Jack Parsons' life.
Well, yeah, by this point, by the end of his life, he had been, this is during the Red Scare in the United States. So he had been stripped of his scientific clearance, his top secret scientific clearance. He couldn't work on rockets. This is because he had been friendly with various communists before the war, and also because he had been the head of an OTO chapter in Pasadena. Let's not, try and sugarcoat that. But he had been kind of thrown out of the scientific world. He had no, Crowley was dead. There was really nobody he could turn to. Even Marjorie Cameron had left him for months at a time. But at the end of their life, at the end of his life, it's 1952, they had got back together and they were planning a new life together in Mexico. And Parsons had written to a couple of people or spoken to a couple of people. So he was going to go down there. He was going to create, some people he said he was going to, make wine down there. To others, he said he was going to build a fireworks factory. All these different plans he had. And on his last days, he was doing various odd jobs. He had basically been reduced to kind of making special effects for film companies. That's his great explosive acumen that had, helped create the science of rocketry, was now making squibs, to go under your clothing to look like bullets in all the World War II pictures that were being made at the time. And so he was making this order of special effects. And, at some point when he was in his home laboratory in Pasadena, Marjorie Cameron had gone out. He was making these explosives, we think, and at some point an accident happened, and or was it an accident? That's what we have to know. Now, the straight up journalistic argument, analysis of this is that he was mixing chemicals for this special effects company. He, had often taken lots of methamphetamine to kind of get into work long hours. He had sweated a lot. Just people always mention he sweated a lot. And he had dropped a container he was making the special effects in. He had gone to grasp it, and it exploded. When his body was found, he was still alive, but half his face was kind of torn off and his right arm was missing, which, they would say he had tried to grasp the falling beaker of explosive mixture, but he hadn't reached it in time, and it had blown off his right arm and half his face. So that's the journalistic thing. But other people say, well, he was upset at the time. He had lost everything. Could this have been a suicide? Could he have just had enough and decided to kill himself? He knew how to deal with explosives. He wasn't an idiot. Would he really have dropped, explosives while he was making them? Was that the sort of thing he wanted? And, still others said, well, he didn't seem unhappy. Are you sure it was a suicide? Are you sure it was an accident? Maybe this was something he was actually conjuring. Was he in the middle of a magical working? Some people said to create some kind of fire demon that in the end consumed him. Now, so you have kind of suicide, you have a magical working gone wrong, you have an accident, or you have even, some people have said that it was an assassination, it was a murder, because when he had been younger, he had actually given evidence against various crooked cops who used car bombs to kill their enemies. And people thought maybe this crooked cop he had given evidence against had tried to kill him. So there you have it. You have murder, you have suicide, you have a magical working gone wrong, or you have an accident. I personally go on.
I was going to say I tend to the sort of it was an accident. I mean, on the day that they were going to move down to Mexico, wasn't it? Everything was packed. All their bags were packed, and it was a last minute request that he was attending to. It's like a last little task he was going to do, and also the chemicals, which he shouldn't have kept in inside the shed. Which because they were dangerous and very dangerous, which he understood. He had to move those from somewhere else, didn't he? When he was somebody else hired out the place they was keeping them. So again, they shouldn't have been there. So so there's all those little accidents of the messiness of the real life, I suppose.
I think you're right. I mean, when in the book I say that is probably the reason. Even though he was a genius with chemicals, he always had a kind of devil-may-care attitude, to them. He always felt so confident with them that I don't think he ever put any proper security procedures, or kind of, locked up his chemicals properly. And I think it probably just what he really had been looking forward to this new life in Mexico with Cameron. And I just think it was a terrible mistake, but that didn't stop the rumors from flying.
Yeah, pushing the boundaries and living dangerously were definitely part of his spirit, and so that's in keeping with that.
Definitely,
he flew too close to the sun.
Yeah,
very true.
So, what's interesting with Parsons is that he's one of a very small club of occultists that seem to sort of endure the test of time. You have Crowley, obviously, you have people like Blavatsky and stuff, but Parsons is like, he really has endured the story of his life. The kind of myth of Parsons has endured. Why do you think that is?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, there is something, just having talked about his death, about him dying when he did, that you kind of end with this kind of, the mystery of it, but also the potential. You're never left with him, in his last days, renouncing everything or anything like that. He kind of ended, he died when he was 37. He's this kind of, and he was a striking, good-looking guy. But I think there's something about the way he bestrode both the kind of old world and the new world, which is endlessly fascinating. I think he is this kind of last link, it feels like, to one step further than Crowley, to linking that Victorian mystical society with the modern space age world, in which it's very hard to imagine mysticism really existing sometimes, when we're in our, as you say, our caves, watching TV, eating pizza. It's hard to imagine there's much magic there. But I think Parsons kind of hints at that. He hints that even in the heart of science, you can still kind of carve out this magical experience for yourself.
Interesting. That's great. It's been great to talk to you. To let us know kind of what you're up to at the moment. Have you got projects on the burner, as it were?
I'm up to, I spread myself pretty wide about things. So at the moment, it's nothing quite in the Parsons vein, but it's similarly about a strange situation that happened in 1974. But it's more, as with drawing stories about Los Angeles and the 1930s and trying to pull it out. This is England in 1974 and trying to bring up all the strands that existed at that time with the 3-day week, with the strikes, with the blackouts, and with the hints of a military coup that almost happened in England in 1974. That's keeping me busy.
Excellent. Well, it's been a real pleasure, and we've been wanting to speak with you for a very long time, actually. So
I know it's been a while from when you first contacted me to now. It's been a while, but I hope that was all right.
Oh, it's great. Thank you so much. And we're back. So how did you find that interview, Mr. Satyr?
Oh, excellent! Like I said, it's the book is superb. It is one of the best books of its kind, and without a doubt, the definitive work on the subject matter. So, and excellent, an excellent work. Very lucid, wonderfully researched, and human. It's and humane in the deepest sense, broadest sense. You get a sense of the humanity of the people he's talking about.
Yeah, it's interesting. And one mystery was revealed, that we didn't actually realise he was British, did we?
No, we didn't.
It's a poor research in our case there.
Well, it was a bit of an assumption, an understandable one, an understandable assumption. We won't hold it against him. But, yes, so yeah, excellent stuff. And again, I feel so grateful that he gave his time and energy to us. So
yeah, Mark's been a big fanboy of this book for a long time.
I have. I've bored people senseless with pushing it, and actually, it doesn't need me to do it. You read it. The wonderful thing about it is it talks about, if you're interested in science fiction and the influence of science fiction culture and history, and in science itself, that could be your way in. That's it, because it does great justice to that. If you're interested in the science part and the social history of the science relating to rockets and jet propulsion, there's that way in, and then there's also, of course, the occult magical aspects in. So all those things feed in. It's like these three paths going in, and Pendle is an excellent writer, and he does real justice to each subject.
He does a great job of weaving them together, doesn't he?
I see as the underlying unity of them. Yeah, now they feed into each other. Things which we've talked about in the chat with him. Things which initially you would think, well, how do those two things go together? The science of jet propulsion and science fiction. Okay, you can see that, but how does this occult magical side of life, how does that feed in? But they do. They do, and when you go deeper into it, you see that. And for Jack Parsons, they fed his soul. He was a hungry soul, and they fed his soul.
Yeah, it's interesting because we always say this, that there's so much more we could have spoken about. With this subject, there really is so much more we could have.
And we will, because undoubtedly Jack Parsons will pop up again. He'll flare up again.
Yeah.
And we will definitely be.
There are certain recurring characters on this show, aren't there? There's Mr. Crowley, obviously. Then there's Mr. Grant, who reappears almost every episode. It feels at the moment.
Also, as well, Crowley was a mountaineer. There was in him this drive to ascend physically to the height. And Jack Parsons is similar in a sense. He had this drive to ascend physically through rocket science. There's that aspiration to the stars.
Yeah, it's interesting. Anyway, if you want to find us online, Sitting Now on Instagram, that's one word, Sitting Now. That's probably the best place to find us at the moment. That's where I spend more time than any. But you can also find us on Twitter, same thing, Sitting Now. Sittingnow.co.uk is our web home. I'm slowly starting to post stories there again now. We just did one about the efforts of Strange Attractor Press to put out Austin Osman Spare's tarot deck, which has never been released before, so that'll be interesting. Also on YouTube, Sitting Now, where you can join us, where new content will be going up regularly. Anyway, we look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.
Mm-hmm.